I am Bernhard Ruchti, and this is segment 6 of my talk about my new recording of 2 Beethoven piano sonatas. In this segment I'm going to be talking about practical aspects of metronome markings and tempo in the 2 sonatas that I have recorded. And I'm going to start with Opus 110 because this sonata, to me, is a perfect example for the fact that double beat interpretation of historical metronome markings is accurate. Okay, let's have a look at the first movement. The movement name says Moderato cantabile molto espressivo. That means moderately fast, singing, and very expressive. So we have a moderately fast or rather slow movement as a first movement. The time signature says 3/4, like 3 quarter notes or crotchets. And the metronome marking says quarter note or crotchet equals 76. If I take that as single beat, it sounds like this. Now, those of you who know that piece already will probably agree that this is a very fast tempo for that kind of movement. It's not moderately fast and it's not very expressive. This becomes even more obvious when the part starts with the 32nd notes or demi-semiquaver notes in bar 12. This would sound like this. So this has a rather virtuoso attitude and not at all a very expressive attitude. If we now move on to double beat interpretation of the metronome marking, we get this as a result. So instantly we have a very expressive character, intimate almost, which as well becomes more obvious even when it comes to bar 12 with the semi-demi-quavers or 32nd notes. And in that part actually we can do that lovely articulation Beethoven gives us with the points on every 8th note when it goes down, and the points on every quarter note when it goes back up. Now this sounds like this. So we see that with that interpretation of the metronome marking, also this part remains very expressive. In other words, we hear a music that matches perfectly what the movement name says. Okay, let's move on to the second movement. So the second movement is actually very interesting, not only regarding the metronome marking that Czerny gives, but also regarding the time signature that Beethoven gives. The movement name says Allegro molto, so very much allegro, so to speak. The time signature says 2/4, 2 quarter notes. Czerny's metronome marking says half note or minim equals 120. If I take that again as a single beat, then it sounds like this. Once again, this is playable absolutely, it's quite fast. But now, the important thing here is, if you didn't know how this was written down, how would you write down that melody? Or, in other words, how would you count that melody? In my opinion, there are two possibilities, two options. First one is to count ya-da-dee-da-dum-bum-bum, like a big cut time with an emphasis on the first note and a notation in eighth notes. Second option would be to go a little faster and to count dee-da-dee-da-dum-bum-bum. This would be a little smaller cut time bar with quarter notes or crotchets and an emphasis also on the first note and on the fifth note. I guess no one would count like this, dee-da-dee-da-dum-bum-bum. Or if I conduct it, ya-ya-da-da-dum-bum-bum. It just makes no sense. Now, interestingly, Beethoven's notation is neither the first option nor the second one. What he writes is something very interesting, and I'm going to show you that right here. Here we see the first option, like a big cut time with 8 notes. Ya-da-dee-da-dum-bum-bum. Here we see the second option, a smaller cut time bar, which would be ya-da-dee-da-dum-bum-bum. So, he doesn't write that. He doesn't even write a regular common time bar, which would be ya-da-dee-da-dum-bum-bum. But he writes the smallest possible bar he can write for that kind of melody, which is a 2/4 bar with an emphasis on that note and on this one equally. And as a result, we get ya-da-dee-da-dum-bum-bum. That's what he writes. Or if I play that, ya-dee-dee-da-dum-bum-bum. And with the full harmony, it's like that. That's what Beethoven's time signature indicates. And, big surprise, in a very natural way, we ended up playing double beat. We ended up at a beat of 60 for the half note instead of 120. So once again, I'm going to play that for you just to show how natural it sounds. So this for me would be a perfect example for Czerny's category, majestic, grand, or even sublime. We could easily imagine that piece set for orchestra, for instance, with the strings starting, and then the brass section coming in, and then full orchestra. So, we see as a result, we have a music that matches perfectly the character, the time signature, and the metronome marking. So the third movement is actually a good example for the opposite. This movement is usually played too slow nowadays. The movement name is Adagio ma non troppo, which means adagio but not too much. Time signature is a common time bar, and we have a metronome marking that says 8th note or quaver note equals 66. So the note value of the metronome marking is already half the value of the time signature, which means we don't have to change anything. Now, this is usually played like this. So, in other words, very slow, which is of course possible, very much adagio, and I suspect that pianists, perhaps after all the rush and hectic of the first two movements, just feel the need to calm down here a bit. But that is not what Czerny's metronome marking says. If I take Czerny's metronome marking and play along to it, it sounds like this. So it's still slow, yes, but it also has a flow at the same time. And this is exactly what the movement name says, because it does not say adagio molto, but adagio ma non troppo, adagio but not too much. So once again, we have a metronome marking that matches perfectly the movement name. After that, the fugue starts. And I'm not going to talk much about that. Obviously, I also take the metronome marking as double beat, and as a result, we hear every single note that Beethoven wrote, every single lovely counterpoint that he wrote, and it's just a joy to follow the music in that fugue. All right, so those were some remarks on Opus 110. And I'm going to talk about Opus 2 number 1 in the next segment. Now, please subscribe to my channel, don't forget to like, and don't forget to ring the bell to get notified when there is any news.